Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is going to be my May cover. And I've had two little bluebirds. They have successfully raised 4 babies in my bluebird house. I put it out last year and they were in the bluebird house. They laid eggs, but then nothing, I think a snake may have gotten them. The eggs, not the actual mama and daddy. And they came back this year and they were successful, finally. And they raised 4 little babies, so I have been just inspired by them. They are beautiful birds, an Eastern Bluebird. They are just so pretty. Now, the first thing I did with his eye, of course, I mixed a nice black. You can use tube black if you want, but I mixed indigo and a brown. I think it was burnt umber. I left the white of the paper for his highlight of his eye. And now I'm just wetting his head, and I've got 3 different blues out here. I like to mix my blues. I have a warm blue, a sort of neutral blue, or that's kind of right in the middle, and then I have a cooler blue. And I'm just going to do those all together in a wet and wet technique. Where I want it to be lighter, I'm going with the paler, more warm blue. Where I want it to be darker, I'm going, of course, with the darker, cooler blue. And I'm doing the same with his wings. I'm just putting on a thin coating of clean water, and then I'm just going to drop those blues in there. I'm going to let this layer dry, come back, add some more layers with some more details after it dries completely. And it's just, this bluebird is really not difficult at all. It is probably one of the more simple, I think, covers that I've made for my bullet journal. And my bullet journal just keeps getting more and more simple. I'm getting more, because I'm kind of honing in on what I'm using this bullet journal for, which is basically content scheduling, creation, and those kinds of ideas. So now the wing had a little bit too much blue in some of the areas, so I just washed my brush. I dabbed it off so that it was dry, and I picked up some of that pigment. Now I'm going to be really careful because I do not want to get that blue to bleed into this water, but I am going to cover his chest with water. I've mixed up sort of a burnt orange color. It's a little bit of a brownish burnt orange color. If you want the exact colors, you can join my Dabbler tier on Patreon. It's only $5 a month. And with this, you would get the outline drawing, the supply list, and all the things to help you create this project. So now with that, I actually mixed 2 shades of this sort of burnt orange, a really deep shade and then a lighter shade. Wet his chest where this burnt orange shade is, and I'm just dropping the paint in there. And where of course I want shadows, I'm putting the darker color in there. Where I want it to be a little bit like of a mid-tone to light, I'm putting that lighter, paler version. And then the areas where I want it to be really light, I'm either not putting any paint there, or I'm just kind of lifting some of that pigment up with my damp, dry brush. And in some areas where I want to give it texture, I'm just coming back in and dropping a little bit more of that darker paint. Now I'm going to that mixture, the same one that I used for his eye, that brown and blue mixture. We're going to paint the top part of his beak. And then the bottom part of his beak is a little bit darker. Of course, it's in shadow, so it's going to be a little bit darker. And I'm leaving just like the tiniest little white thin line between the upper and the lower beak, because that has a little bit of a peach color to it. So I want to get that peachy color in there as well, so you can see that little white area that I've left. I'm also coming around, and I put a little bit more sort of eyeliner around his eye as well. I just dropped in that peachy brown color. It's almost the same color as his chest, and it has blended with a little bit of that blackish gray, that deep gray that we put in for his beaks, because they were still wet, and that's fine. It does not bother me. His tail has dried some, so I'm just going into my darker blue. I'm adding a few lines so that it separates the tail feathers from each other. Gives it just a little bit more detail. I really like that. The first time that I saw an Eastern Bluebird, I thought they were fake birds. They were so blue. The blue is so intense on the males. I thought it was a fake bird. I'm like, is that a real bird, or is that just like a toy or something? I didn't know, but I am so delighted that they are actually real birds. They are actually a beautiful, gorgeous, bright blue. Their chest is a nice rusty orange color. For the males, the females are blue, but they're more of a sort of, I call it a blue-gray. They're still pretty. They're just not as intense as the males. So what I'm doing with the blue is I'm coming back in, I'm painting in the shadows. I'm also separating those feathers with just plain brush marks, just plain lines around his eyes. I'm darkening that area up. He has some shadow on the back, the back side of his eye, right on his neck where the blue meets the orange. He has a little bit of shadow. So that's all I'm doing there. And then right under that orange, right on his very lower belly, it's a white color. It's white, but I am going to do the shadows with sort of a watery pale gray, and I'm just using that same color that I used for his eye and his beak, but to lighten it, I'm just adding a little extra water. No big deal. It's not, it's not anything difficult, and I'm just doing that in shapes. I'm kind of looking at the reference photo and trying to pick out the shapes of the shadows and just redo those on his belly on my painting. And now these flowers are sort of made up flowers. I made them up. They are real flowers. They're quince flowers. I think that's how they're pronounced. But I added my own little twist to them, so they're not exactly anatomically correct as the flower, and they're also not the right color because I changed the color to be more of a pink. And what I did is I just painted the whole thing with a really pale watery mix of pink. While it was still wet, I got a little bit of a darker pinkish rose, and I came in there and dropped that in the shadow areas while it was still wet. And I tried to keep it in the areas where I didn't want it to spread over the whole pink flower. I wanted those shadows to stay where I put them. So a trick to do that is once you dip your brush into your paint, your darker pink paint, tap it on the paper towel or whatever you use to dry your brushes. Just do a little tap. That'll take some of the water out, and that'll give you just a little bit more control over where that paint stays. It won't spread out as much. Now if you have a lot of water, it's going to spread all over, and you're not going to be able to tell the shadows from the lights because it's going to mix on the paper, and it'll just turn into one flat tone of pink. So when you're working wet on wet, this is a little tip, write it down. When you're working on wet and wet and you want to add like a shadow color or a darker color, but you don't want it to spread and mix on the whole area since it's still wet or damp, what you do is once you load up your brush with your paint, you just tap it on your paper towel or your towel or whatever you're using to dry your brush. That will suck some of the water out, and you'll be able to pretty much place it where you want. It'll still go a little ways, and it might not be in like exact as if you were doing wet on dry, but it will give that soft, smooth edge, that really soft edge that you want. And you can come back and fix the edges later with a glaze on once it's dry. So it is not a big deal, but that is a little trick that will help you control your paint a little bit better when you're doing wet and wet. Just dab off some of the water from the brush before you touch it to that wet area, and you'll have a little better control. Now you see I'm deepening up these shadows on the flower and just kind of blending the edges out with the tip of my brush toward the tips of the petals. I'm starting with the darkest part of the flower in the center, the darkest color, that shadow color, and then just blending it out toward the tips, letting it get a little bit lighter as it goes towards the tips of the petals, because of course they're reaching out toward the sun, so they're in the light a little bit more, and they're going to be a lot lighter. And you don't have to get too fussy about these flowers. They're really simple. It's just a matter of getting in those lights and darks and working a little bit of wet on wet, and then when you want to refine it and get those exact shapes, once it's dry, you can just come back and glaze over it with a little bit more paint to either darken up the shadows, fix the edges, whatever you need to do. So it's really not a difficult flower. It's pretty forgiving. There's only a few petals. It's really basic. And I think it really goes really well with that blue of the bluebird. Maybe I should have made the flowers orange or like a coral color to match his chest. I don't know. Maybe if I did it again, I would. You can paint it any way. You can choose whatever color flowers you want. You can make the flowers blue to match his blue feathers. You can make it coral to match his chest feathers. You can mix orange and pink to get a nice peach and do that as well. It's completely, totally up to you. But I chose pink. And then for the leaves, I just put in like I think that was a green gold I started with. That's my lightest green. And then I went to like a sap green for the darker shadow areas. Also worked wet on wet. I put that green gold down first, and then while it was still wet, I came in there with the darker green to get in those shadows where I wanted them. And it worked out really pretty. I like this color green with this color pink. They just seem to go together, this sort of lemony, yellowish green with this soft rosy pink. I just like that color combination. And after these dry, you see I'm just doing some line work with my brush on dry paper. This is where you get the details more refined. Once it's dry, you just come back in there and glaze over the areas, putting in your details, and cleaning up some areas, deepening up your shadows. That's how you do it. I'm also darkening up some shadows on his white tummy. And now I'm just dipping in there into my white gouache. I'm cheating again because I didn't want to use any masking fluid. And I'm just taking some of that white gouache and doing little tiny dots for the stamen inside of the flower. And then a few little highlighted feathers on his chest. And then I also added just a little bit of yellow to that white gouache so that those stamen in the flower weren't just pure white. They had a little bit of gold to them. And I'm coming back in with a really, really deep rose color and just adding those last few darkest shadows. And that really makes it pop. That has a lot of contrast with the lighter colors of the petals. So it looks really good. And it starts to define the flower so much better. As you see, there really hasn't been anything overly complicated. I mean, you can get fussy with the flowers, but you don't need to. I was probably starting to get a little too fussy with them, but you don't really have to. So now I decided that those stamens really weren't bright enough, so I mixed a little bit more yellow with my white gouache, and I'm just dabbing it with my little detail brush. I love golden maple detail brushes to do really tiny details. They are my favorite. I can highly recommend them. I'll link them in the description just in case you're interested. But you can get a set of them for less than $20, and I have loved these. I've been using them for over a year now, and I've loved these maple detail brushes for smaller paintings. Then I got some pure white gouache since I contaminated my other gouache with the yellow, and I'm just putting in some white highlights across those feathers where I feel like he needs it a little bit. You can put a few white highlights on the flowers if you want to. Totally up to you. Use your artistic, your artistic license and your own instincts. Now I have mixed some of the white gouache with a little bit of that rose color, and I am just going to go ahead and put it down on that circle that I have behind the bird. I just did a little circle around him just as a designerly sort of effect. I'm adding a little blue to that rose color to make it more purple. And I'm just painting around in that circle. I'm doing a wet and wet technique, but I have used I've used a little bit of gouache in there. Gouache makes it a little bit more opaque, but it also changes your colors, your watercolors. It makes them more toward the pastel instead of the saturated colors. So that's what I've done with my gouache. I've just made my colors a little more pastel. They're a tiny bit opaque, but since I'm using so much water, it's still transparent. It's probably not as transparent as it would be if I had not added the gouache, but it is transparent enough for me. And I'm just going around with that wet rose mixed with a little bit of white gouache, with a little bit of blue to make purple. And I'm just going all around the circle, doing a lot of wet and wet, and just dropping more and more color in where I want it to be a little bit darker, where I want it to be a little more shadowed. I'm just adding a little more blue and dropping a little bit more of the pigment into that part of the painting. Whew, that was a mouthful. I'm gonna have to take a breath. And then once I'm getting this painted, I'm going to let it dry completely. And once I let it dry completely, I'm going to cut this out from my watercolor paper. Now, I used 140-pound cold pressed paper for this. And I tried to size it to the size of my journal. And I was just going to glue the whole paper in there. But now I'm thinking I am going to cut this out, and I may put a blue background behind this with some craft paper or some scrapbook paper. I'm not sure. That's what I was thinking when I was doing this. What would make it really pop? So I apologize for the lighting. It was getting late in the afternoon, and I was trying to get this finished for you guys. I am so far behind because in my Patreon, I am adding tons of tutorials. I have almost 100 mini tutorials in there for my dabbler tier, and that has taken me some time to get them all uploaded. So I've gotten a little bit behind with my YouTube channel, but I'm back, baby. I am back. We are gonna get this done. Now I decided he needed to be a lot darker underneath him where he's sitting on top of the flowers, because of course he's shadowing that. The sun's not going to be reaching that area. So I'm adding a lot more of the bluish purple. I've just mixed rose and blue together to get that purple. And of course I've used a cool blue to get the purple, so it'll be a nice vibrant purple. I did not mix it with the warm blue because that would give it sort of a grayed down purple. All right, so I let that dry, and just like I told you, I decided I would take some scrapbook paper, and I tried to match his feathers on his back. Then I just took a corner punch. I punched that. I attached it with glue. They call it, what is it called? Glue tape. Attached it in my journal. I'm cutting around my design, and I'm leaving a thin white border because I want it to be separate from that blue. I don't want to put the two blues right on top of each other. I don't want the blue of his feathers to be right on top of the blue of the scrapbook paper. So I'm just doing a little cut around it, leaving a little thin white border to separate it. And I'm pretty pleased with how it came out. So I'm glad that I decided to do that. Sometimes my ideas aren't that great. So then I'm going to do the glue tape again, put him in there, try to center him up. And then that was going to be for my cover page. I decided to do a quote on the other side. And I got out my white gel pen, and then I got out one of my acrylic pens. It's just an inexpensive brand. I don't even know the name of the brand, but it's an acrylic pink pen. I wish I'd went with rose instead of this bright pink. It's a little too bright pink. And as a matter of fact, after I went over it, or after I finished it, I went over the bright pink with a rose pink watercolor marker to just sort of knock back some of that bright pink. And my quote is I'll read it to you when I finish. And so what I did is I did every other line with white, and then I did every other line with the other lines with pink, trying to match it up with my bird and the flowers. And I really liked it. I just used my own handwriting, my own cursive handwriting. I didn't try to do any fancy fonts because I'm terrible at that. But I will learn. I will get there. I will learn. So May is the month of expectations, the month of wishes, and the month of hope. Emily Bronte. So then I am just going to cut the corners on that, round those off so it sort of matches the vibe of my journal. Do the glue. You can see where I practiced on the back. Do my glue tape and tape it in, and then we're going to write May at the bottom and color that in with some pink. And that is all there is to my cover for my May journal. And I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, if you want the outline drawing for my cover photo, for my cover painting, then join my Dabbler tier in my Patreon. I'll link that below. It's $5 a month. You get so much for that $5. You'd be surprised. There, like I said, there's already almost 100 mini tutorials there just waiting for you. So I did that with my May. I've colored it all in. And there you have it. That is my little May cover spread, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. Big shout out to my patrons. Without you, I could not do this, and I appreciate every bit of your support. See you soon.